This Week in Startups is brought to you by LinkedIn. You need LinkedIn jobs to find the right people for your business. Post a job today at linkedin.com/twist and get $50 off your first job post. Silicon Valley Bank. Big ideas don't fit into standard packages. That's why Silicon Valley Bank has banking and financial solutions tailored for startups that help them reach their milestones faster. svb.com/next to learn more. And HubSpot. Join thousands of startups that are growing better with HubSpot for Startups. Learn more and get extra benefits for being a Twist listener now at hubspot.com/startups/twist.
I'm really excited to kick it off, right? Very pleased, a first-time Founder.University speaker, Mike Ghaffary, who is going to talk about strategic advantages and how you can just crush your fundraising, right? Is that right, Mike?
Thank you.
Please, warm welcome for Mike. Take it away. And hold questions to the end, please.
Hello, everybody. I realized before I go to my first slide that I don't have a slide with background on me. So maybe it's good to give a quick background on who I am, and then we can jump into the content. So my name is Mike Ghaffary. I'm a venture capitalist, general partner at Canvas Ventures. We invest typically in Series A and B rounds, $5 to $20 million. We're a $300 million fund on Fund 2. And I, in particular, love marketplace business models, but I invest across consumer and software companies in general, probably like 70-30 roughly ratio of consumer versus kind of B2B and enterprise SaaS software. My operating background, before I was investing, I was an operator. So I started life as a computer scientist. I did grad school, and I started investing at Summit Partners back in 2006, doing later stage investing, but I wanted to be an earlier stage investor. And I thought that the best early stage investors actually have deep operating experience. So I then went back to operating. I had done some startups before, but I went back to real operating for 10 years. Co-founded Stitcher, which is a personalized radio startup, a podcasting startup that sold to Deezer. I was at TrialPay, which sold to Visa, and I was at Yelp for 7 years. As we took that company public, I was the VP of Business and Corporate Development, did 200 partnerships, got to know a lot of startups that way, started acquiring companies. We acquired this little company called E947, and they actually asked me to run E947 as the CEO of the company as a subsidiary within Yelp. So I was a CEO there. We grew, I think first partnered with E947 when they had about 10 employees. So maybe a little larger than some of the companies in this room, but not much. And then saw that company start to grow as our really close partner. Acquired them when it was around 150 employees. And then we grew it to 500 employees and like 700 million in annual gross transaction volume. So saw quite a bit of scale, and that'll feed into this talk a little bit as well. One thing I realized to look for in any company, both when you're operating it or you're thinking about investing in it, is what's your strategic advantage? What's your long-term kind of sustainable reason that you'll stay in business? I've now invested in about 25 companies, usually around Series A, but sometimes earlier, sometimes later. So some of the companies I've invested in are like Strava, Optimizely, Metromile, Phil's Coffee. What's the strategic advantage there? I was trying to figure that one out. Superhuman, which Jason from Launch invested in early on. He was just talking about that. Cambly, Hubhouse, Cloud Kitchen, several companies, and only a fraction of those, less than half are marketplaces. But one reason I'm drawn to a lot of those are they have a strategic advantage. And in all the other companies, when they weren't a marketplace, then I really dig in on this. So today we're going to kind of cover this topic a little bit. I'll talk about it for a while, and then I'd invite you guys to ask questions when we're done. I try to keep the deck relatively short. So every startup needs a strategic advantage. This is the common way you'll hear about it sometimes. If you're sitting with an investor, this might be already obvious to you if you've done dozens of investor meetings. But if you haven't, an investor says, "So what's your moat? What's the moat here?" I'm not seeing that. I've seen investors say that, and sometimes they get a blank stare with a first-time founder, like, "What do you mean? What's my moat? I don't live in a castle." So this idea is you've got some kind of a moat around your castle. It's an analogy. And that's the defensibility for this business castle you're building. But it's interesting. Ryan Peterson, the founder of Flexport, just went on Twitter. I don't know if you saw this. He thought moat was actually an outdated analogy. Like a lot of these businesses we're seeing are not retreating into this like small castle, trapped there waiting, hoping they can outlast this army that's trying to storm them from the outside. So he gave another analogy. You could look that up if you're interested. But this is all what we're kind of talking about. Other words you'll hear are defensibility sometimes. And strategic advantage, I think, actually means more than just a moat or defensibility. But we'll kind of talk about that. But these are all different ways of getting at a similar set of questions. And by the way, this little graphic shows people storming this castle in this moat. If you don't have a strategic advantage, investors might be skeptical. And you shouldn't build your business just to please investors. The more important thing is you should be a little bit concerned if you don't have a strategic advantage, because what that means, the reason the investors are concerned and the reason you should be concerned is business might be going really well for now if you don't have a strategic advantage. A lot of companies will start that way and they'll kind of hit it and everything will be going great. And then you'll get several copycat businesses trying to do exactly what you're doing because they see it's a good business model. Big companies, small companies, everything in between, and they'll drive all the margin and kind of benefits that you had in the business out of it. And pretty soon you might be out of business. So that's why you have to think about this. And let's give some examples of types of strategic advantages. So a marketplace with network effects, that's where we're going to spend the most time just to do a deep dive. I can't deep dive on all of these, but that's one. Yeah, feel free to take pictures or whatever of this if you want. Another one is same side network effects. So marketplaces have what we call two-side network effects, and we'll talk about those, and I'll define a marketplace as well. But other companies don't necessarily have a marketplace, but they have same-side network effects. So let's take Facebook in the early days, for example, before they had an ad model. Just like the fax machine, which is the classic example, every time a new user signs up for a fax machine or for Facebook, the service itself gets more valuable. Facebook with one user, when it was just Zuck sitting there by himself with Facebook, not so useful. No information about other people, no one to connect to, nobody to add as a friend. Imagine how lonely that was. It was like add friend. Oh, there are no friends to add. But once it got 100 users, it got a lot more useful. Once it got 10,000 users, it got exponentially more useful. And the more and more users they added, the more useful the service became. We can kind of mathematically try to describe this. It's not an exact science, but you can say, are there increasing, accelerating network effects? Are there diminishing network effects? Like I would argue now Facebook probably has diminishing marginal network effects, right? It's not getting that much more useful just because more people are signing up. In their early days, the network effects were increasing exponentially. It became so much more useful for those of you who are old enough to have been on from the early days of the service. And I was in grad school at one of the schools, in their network. It went from a couple people in your class being on Facebook that you could add, and it was kind of medium, not really useful. And then all of a sudden you had to be on it, and it was so important, and everybody was on it, and that was quite useful. And it locked it in too, because the other piece is switching costs. Then the question becomes, well, how hard is it to switch to another network? It famously wasn't that hard to switch from Friendster to MySpace to Facebook, but somehow Facebook kept people, and so that's interesting to study as well. You could also have a data moat. If you look at Google's got an incredible data advantage. They ingest so much data, and they've been able to get that position, and we could spend hours just talking about how they did that. But that's another source of advantage. You can just be a first mover and then, related to that, just build a brand. And all these companies have some element of brand. So your strategic advantage often then plays into building a brand that hopefully props you up. But some investors will say the brand on its own isn't enough to sustain. But a first mover could be an advantage. And then finally, this is something that applies to network effects as well, but can be independent of network effects too, or just high switching costs. You have a very sticky product is a way you'll hear it described sometimes. So something like, Oracle or Salesforce, especially Oracle, right? It used to be that to even get Oracle installed, that would come with an army of Accenture consultants who would show up to your office. You're like, well, I paid $1 million just to install this thing. I'm not going to rip this out now, right? And people have a hard time ignoring sunk costs. And truly on the margin, it's difficult for them to think about switching. So these are all various examples. One or more of these might apply to your business. There might be a new category not on here. I didn't capture everything that applies to your business, your strategic advantage. I will pause here for a second. I'd say just look at the slide, try to figure out which bucket you're in or some other bucket. If you can't think of any, if you're in two, great, one is enough. But if you can't fit into anywhere here and it's kind of still doesn't seem to apply to you, then I'd say that's worth thinking about. Talk to your co-founder, talk to your investors or your friends. And before you try to go out big and do a big pitch, make sure you've really nailed down what this is, and then make sure you're communicating that clearly, probably in a slide in your deck. Beyond just, we're early in the market. People love us. I'll see sometimes like, oh, we're great, we're different because people love what we do. Well, yeah, I mean, of course, you're a startup, you're getting users. Like, of course people love it, but there's got to be one of these.
Hiring is always hard, and it's getting really hard today because we've got unemployment at historic lows. Also, many people just throw a job posting out there. They put it on their job board or some random message board or dump it in your Slack room. That's not going to work. It's not going to work. But what is going to work is to go ahead and use LinkedIn. LinkedIn is where 610 million members visit, and they do that to make connections, learn and grow as professionals. And sometimes they're looking to discover new job opportunities, or sometimes they're passive job seekers. And that is the secret. Not everybody is going to a job board every day looking for jobs, but LinkedIn will present opportunities to those hundreds of millions of LinkedIn users. And here's how easy it is. You just simply go to LinkedIn, and it's really easy because you say where you're looking for the person, you put in your job, you can then look for what experiences you want them to have. How many years of marketing, you set a budget, boom. It's up and running, and you will find somebody quickly. How do I know this? Because we found 2 of our 15 team members on LinkedIn very recently. Sir Charles, our new director, and our marketing manager, Maureen. You can create these job listings quickly and easily, and I'm going to give you $50 right now. That's right, $50 right now for your first job posting. I want you to go to linkedin.com/twist. Go to linkedin.com/twist, and you will get $50 off your first job posting. Terms and conditions, of course, apply. Let's get back to this amazing episode.
So let's talk about network effects. We did this a little bit in the Facebook example, but I think the interesting thing here is, this is why I was saying it can become exponentially more valuable, because 8 users in this example is 28 connections, right? It's not even scaling linearly with the value of adding to the network. It's scaling exponentially. Even if once you have like a couple billion users, then there's maybe some diminishing marginal returns. And then let's talk about how you evaluate a strategic advantage, go deep on one. And the way I'm going to do that is with this marketplace set of businesses. I'll define what a marketplace is, by the way. A marketplace is a 2-sided network that matches supply and demand, buyers and sellers, or there's all kinds, in Airbnb, that's guests and hosts. With Uber, that's, drivers and riders, right? So it's this 2-sided network that has a supply of something and a demand of something else. They're going to bring those people together. And unlike Facebook, it's not necessarily like at Uber, it's not necessarily more valuable to the Uber driver that more Uber drivers are there. It's not a same-sided network, kind of like this. It's only more valuable to them that other people on the other side are on the network. And then it goes the other way. The riders on Uber, they only care that there are more drivers, so they care about the other way. Some 2-sided networks do have these things called same-side network effects, but we can leave that for now. So that's a marketplace, plain and simple. A lot of them actually. There's a venture firm, NFX, that's put out research that I think 70% of the value created by venture-backed companies in the past 20, 30 years has come from businesses with network effects. And I think a big chunk of that, if not the large majority, has been these marketplace business models. Even Amazon has turned into a marketplace. Facebook and Google, their monetization, all their revenue comes from an ad marketplace. So these marketplaces are really important. So that's why I'm going to zoom into that example. But you don't have to be a marketplace, and most companies we as a firm have funded and venture has funded, aren't necessarily one of them. So it's just an example. So how do you evaluate your strategic advantage? So in the example we're going to use, you can really dig in and get granular. Don't just say, okay, I've got the strategic advantage, check. Try to go through, like for marketplaces, I've actually published a 15-item checklist. This isn't even the whole, this is the first 7 questions. You can go online on my Medium account and get the full checklist. I've written articles applying this logic to Uber and Airbnb. So if you just do a Google search for marketplace checklist, Uber, Airbnb, you'll find these, and it'll link to the original longer checklist. And so as an example today, and we can use kind of Uber or Airbnb interchangeably or others, we're going to kind of dig in to a couple of those businesses in this checklist to show you how to get that next level of depth of thinking about your strategic advantage. So one of the first questions you can ask is, which side of the network values the other? You remember I told you there were drivers on the one side and riders on the other side in Uber's network? Well, if you're going to figure out how the dynamics of that marketplace work, you should think, who actually cares more about the other side? And the early days of Uber, this was very obvious. The riders care about the drivers a lot more. There was a lot more demand for riders in the early days of Uber than there was a supply of drivers. That was the whole point. It was started because they had a hard time finding taxis and rides, the founders of the company. So they said, let's start this network. In fact, the head of growth at Uber, this guy named Ed Baker, at the time in the early days, I was talking to him about a partnership with Yelp, and I said, hey, we can drive a bunch of new users for us, and then you can do this. We were talking about going back and forth. He said, yeah, I don't even need new users. I'm the head of growth. He was like a growth lead at Facebook at one point. He said, I should be in charge of getting new users, but I don't even care about getting new users. I just need drivers. If I get drivers, then I get 10 times that many riders for every driver I get. So I have shifted all of my efforts into just getting these drivers. And it showed. They started making $1,000 guarantees. How often have you heard of that? An internet company offering you $1,000, right? PayPal famously offered people free money. Companies have given away free money in the 99 internet phase and then more recently, but it's usually not $1,000. That's a lot of cold hard cash for an internet company to guarantee you. But the reason they're doing it is they realize the driver side is the more valued side. So we should subsidize that side. We should do everything we can to get people on that side of the marketplace. So this is one of the first questions to ask yourself, and we'll kind of get into this more, the nuance, but that's a good framing. Then you got to say, hey, how strong are the cross-side network effects? I sprinkle on supply onto my network, in this case, if supply is the more highly valued side. Sometimes demand's more highly valued, but in this case, supply. Does that lead to more users? You should look in your metrics and say, okay, I added 1,000 drivers or 10 drivers. Did I see a multiple on that of riders of demand come on? If not, then you don't actually understand how your strategic advantage is. Maybe the value flows the other way and you need to subsidize the other side. There's a lot of questions you could ask yourself. And I guess the other thing I'll pause here is it might be that you do have, in this case, a two-sided network, but the two sides just don't value each other that much. It's not, and there's many reasons this could be the case. Maybe there's a lot of substitute products. If the taxi industry had been thriving, let's just do a thought experiment, then Uber wouldn't have been that valuable. You would have added a bunch of, black car drivers in the early day, and people would say, this is just kind of expensive and costs more than a taxi, and I can't even hail them. And there's taxis everywhere. This is why in the early days in New York City, Uber was like, meh. I don't know if any of you guys traveled to New York when Uber Black had just launched and you thought about using Uber. You're like, I'll just take the taxi, right? So network effects were actually kind of weak. But as Uber got a lot of density and then UberX really took off, the price was so low. And in the entire country, basically, besides this small part of Manhattan, taxis were not ubiquitous. Uber's network effects were really strong. Now, the reason we've been asking this question about, which side values the other side and how strong the network effects, one of the reasons we're building this up too is, do you have an effective and proprietary method for distribution to each side of the network, especially that more valued side? So the name of the game, when I'm investing in a consumer business, one of the first questions I ask is, what is your proprietary method for distribution? If we go back to my startup Stitcher, from 10 years ago, was one of the first questions we were asked by all the investors. Well, how are you guys going to get distribution? And we're like, this is when I was saying, it's not enough to just say we're great. We're like, well, look, we're great. Users already love our app. They're downloading it. It must be good. And we're early to the App Store and we're first mover. And it's a podcasting app. Podcasting is going to be huge. Took 10 years and it's still growing. But we said, look, this, and then we actually said, oh, there's some network effects built in and some virality built in. For example, news is inherently viral, and we're a, podcasting news, radio news app. So people will share radio news with each other, and we'll have this virality. The truth is, none of that stuff really worked, and we didn't really have a proprietary distribution method other than being early to the App Store. And as you can see now, the Apple Podcast app still has 50% market share of podcasts, and Stitcher is, I think, neck and neck with like maybe Spotify, but Stitcher's like number 1 or 2 out of independent apps, but it's at like 2% share of all podcasts. That's because there wasn't a sustainable advantage. Even though it's an incredible app, it's got a lot of, I consider it to be a success story for a startup, but it was a very small outcome. It's not a big public independent company. And if I could transport and talk to the 10 years ago myself, I would have made sure we actually sat down and spent more time digging into these kinds of questions. So Uber, as you saw, their proprietary method, it's not so proprietary, but they just got really ahead of how to sign up those drivers. They sent kind of looking at Yelp's model of community managers that have now, lots of companies have copied this, but Uber was one of the first to kind of look at Yelp's playbook and replicate it. It was controversial at the time. It was internet companies weren't supposed to hire people in every market, but Yelp did, and then Uber followed suit, and they just hired a regional manager everywhere. And they got that person on the ground doing PR, do everything they can do to find drivers. And then they paid through the nose, like we saw on that other slide. And they said, if we just get drivers, that's our proprietary method. And riders will just follow. And it worked out. Airbnb is a first mover with a strong brand and that network effect. HomeAway was in the market, but HomeAway was doing longer term stays. And Airbnb really pioneered this short term stay category. No one else in the United States kind of moved fast enough to the point where once they got enough of a name, and there's something about listing your home where you have to have a high degree of trust in who you're going to list your home with. Airbnb got exit velocity, and now they've got the strategic advantage on the supply side. Like, I've thought about listing my home when we were going to go on an extended trip. I wouldn't even think of anybody but Airbnb and HomeAway. And I wouldn't think of HomeAway unless it's going to be a really long-term thing. If you're thinking as a supplier, and again, let me remind you, just like Uber, Airbnb, supply is the more highly valued side of the network. So it's really important to get that supply. Everyone else has a very hard time convincing people to get on their platform. This brand advantage, though, can be tenuous. So you don't want to start with that. But Airbnb luckily got there. You also want to ask yourself how high the switching costs are. This is like the joke we made about the Oracle implementation, the $1 million, Accenture installation. You've got to see how easy it is to switch. One thing about Uber, for example, people think that it's easy to just switch between Uber, Lyft, or another ride-sharing app. But let me ask you this. Let's do a count of hands. Raise your hands if you have the Uber app on your phone. Okay, keep your hands up if you have the Lyft app on your phone. Almost everybody has their hands up for both. Now, keep your hand up if you currently have, and it's logged in with payment credentials, another ride-sharing app on your phone right now. Almost every hand went down. We're down to like less than 5% of the room. So that's really interesting, right? There are switching costs in this industry. While people think, between Uber and Lyft, you can just bounce back and forth. Yes, somehow this became a duopoly. And we can leave analyzing that for another day. But the interesting thing is, to you right now, the cost of downloading another app, giving them your credit card, giving them all the information about like where you go back and forth, there's a little bit of a privacy mental tax there as well. And doing all that, it's just kind of not worth it, especially when you know that Uber and Lyft have already got enough cars for you. So there is some switching costs, right? A true no switching cost environment, for example, just again to paint the thought experiment. Imagine if you just ran the default Maps app on your phone. It's Apple's Maps on the iPhone or Google Maps on Android. And they tried doing this, but they haven't been very successful in shifting users this way. And every ride-sharing service was there, and your payments were all in there. And you just pressed a button, and the closest car out of all of those just came to you very easily. And you didn't have to think about it. You weren't even aware of the brand. Then you might use some of the other ride-sharing apps that came out, right? There was one like Juno or whatever. These other apps might come out, and you might actually use them, but it's not that easy. Switching costs can be tiny, especially in mobile apps and the internet. That's one thing I'll leave you with. It doesn't need to be $1 million Accenture contract. Even a tiny little thing of 90 seconds of a user's time and the wherewithal to go to the App Store, enter their iTunes password, download, install, create an email, password, address maybe, credit card. Like those little steps that all don't sound like much, those could be your switching costs. Don't rely on them, but think that they could be your switching costs. It worked for Uber and Lyft, partially because the network effect is so strong, though, on the supply side. They also knew they were in a race, right? And they used this thing that called blitz scaling, right? That there's a whole book about. They said people will only kind of not suffer that pain of the 3-minute switching costs if we're just the obvious winner, right? If we're kind of like neck and neck, and that's why Uber and Lyft were close. They will do that switching cost. They will download the day that you go on Uber and it's a 12-minute wait to get a car, or even I had a 7-minute wait this morning. If I didn't already have Lyft, like I check Lyft when I see a 7-minute wait, right? But once they got it down where Uber and Lyft were often below 5 minutes in almost every major American city and, and around the world in a lot of places. And on top of that, nobody else could even come close. That's where your perceived ROI on that switching cost got really low. So think about switching costs.
If you work in Silicon Valley and you work in technology, it's not all about ping pong tables and free food and the hoodies. Those are all fun, sure. But there are a lot of challenges throughout the startup journey, and no one understands them quite like our friends at Silicon Valley Bank, where I do my banking personally. Have a great idea for a startup, and I do it professionally actually as well. If you have a great idea for a startup and you don't know the right way to launch it, well, Silicon Valley Bank has helped thousands of startups and is always eager to share their insights. Feel like your company's growing at quantum speed? Well, Silicon Valley Bank strives to support you at your pace, quick, nimble, and always looking ahead. With Silicon Valley Bank, you're not just getting a bank. You're getting a banking and financial services partner, along with the insights and experience and scalable solutions that founders need to move their bold ideas forward faster. I know this because I work with Silicon Valley Bank, and I have for over a decade. And when I email them, man, do I get a quick response. So here's your call to action. If you're a founder, a potential founder, or just someone with an idea and a whole lot of ambition, Silicon Valley Bank has solutions that will help support you from the seed stage to the big stage. So visit svb.com/next to learn more. Silicon Valley Bank. Ideas bank here.
Sorry to emphasize this so much, but there are no network effects really without switching costs. Just kind of, hypothetically, when switching costs go to zero, network effects start to go away. So you want to make sure that you're actually conscious of this. Another question you want to ask yourself as a marketplace is, what does liquidity look like? So what does it mean? And and for each strategic advantage, you should try to have a marquee metric associated with that strategic advantage. Maybe I'll try and go back to that table at some point in the future and assign it. Or any of you guys, if you have a metric for each of those strategic advantages I listed in that table, I'd love to hear your suggestions. For marketplaces, a very straightforward one is liquidity and assigning a metric to liquidity. In Uber's case, it's very simple. Average wait time. We talked about that 7 minutes. If Uber gets down to an average wait time, there's 1 minute, almost never happens. But they do, I think in some cases, have like 2-3 minute average wait times in certain cities and neighborhoods. That's beautiful, right? They see their users. I talked to the person who designed their routing algorithms for Uber, and that was so important for them because they said every minute that they could shave off that wait time created an exponential spike in usage. It's really valuable. So they've got a very clear metric for liquidity that they're matching these buyers and sellers. By the way, you can imagine the driver app. Anyone here ever drove an Uber? Raise your hand. Yeah, we got a couple people. So as you know from the driver app, it's how fast do I get a passenger, right? That's also, so liquidity runs both ways. And the better your liquidity is, the more appealing your marketplace is to both sides of the network. So you've got to define this for every marketplace or every category of strategic advantage differently. I'll give you one more example. Hubhouse. I said, okay, for them, let's ask less about liquidity. They match people to live in, it's a marketplace for long-term housing instead of Airbnb's kind of short-term housing. It's more of a managed marketplace where they actually go lease these homes for a year and then turn around and rent them. So WeWork is kind of similar in commercial. So what is liquidity? What is a metric that you can use to measure strategic advantage there? Well, one way to measure their network effects are how often do people at a Hubhouse home then go switch to another Hubhouse home when they're moving out? And by the way, they're happy, not because they're unhappy. So you've got a perfectly happy person. They had a job in San Jose and they get a job in Berkeley and they don't want to live in San Jose anymore. Do they stay in the network, right? Or do they leave the network? Well, obviously, the more supply, the more homes you have, the more likely they are when they move to stay in the network and go move to like a Hubhouse in Berkeley or Oakland instead of just finding some other random apartment. So Hubhouse saw that metric go from like low single digit percentage when they started. Then they added a bunch of supply and they started seeing that number hit 10%. Like, holy crap, 10% of our users actually just came from our own network. We didn't have to reacquire them. And that number keeps climbing up. That's your strategic advantage. It's very important to drill in. When the Hubhouse founder first met me, she didn't even realize to have that metric in her deck or her metric. This is why I'm giving this talk, is I think founders sometimes don't realize maybe how important this stuff is to investors. And again, my caveat, whenever I say something's important for investors, don't just jump through hoops for investors, but it's important to your own business to understand, like, this is the core of my strategy. And how do I add fuel to that fire? So what we worked on is like, how do I make it more appealing for people to stay in network? Another question asked on any marketplace is frequency of use. The headline here is, the higher the frequency of use, the better. The lower the frequency of use, the worse your strategic advantage. People are not going to be familiar with your brand as much. They're not going to know what's going on. Now, by the way, you don't have to be an A+ on every single one of these things to, stay motivated about your business and to get investors excited. If out of a list of 10, even if you're great on 7 or 8 of those things, that's rare. Even Uber and Airbnb don't get 10 out of 10s. But if you're going down a list of 10 like this for your business, and it's only like 1 or 2 things where you have the advantage, and you can point to other companies and they've got like 5 or 6, that's where you want to ask yourself, okay, is there something I can tweak, or is there a new way to attack this market? Average transaction size is another question. So infrequent transaction and low transaction size, that's like the kiss of death, right? Uber is low transaction size but frequent, so they're okay that they're low transaction. Airbnb is higher transaction size, lower frequency. That's okay too. On the margin, I'd actually take the higher frequency, but Airbnb's working on increasing their frequency through experiences and other categories. Is it easier to acquire incremental supply and demand as the marketplace grows? So this is an important question, right? Like, when you build your marketplace, and your app, you can see the supply. Do you find it easier and easier to get that supply? Like, literally, go down to CPA. Does your CPA, for Airbnb's case, to acquire a new home or a new guest, is that going up with time or going down with time? And with Airbnb, it's getting easier. More and more of their traffic is getting organic. I think it was 60% of their traffic was organic. I could double check those numbers, but that's very compelling to have like 60% of your traffic be organic. And if you're seeing your organic mix increase with time, that's impressive. If you're in a business where your organic mix is flat and your CPA is increasing, that's like the opposite of strategic advantage. By the way, every investor, when you show them your CPA, they assume that that's going to go up by 2, 3x. They don't assume that you're going to keep it, because as you spend more, it does get harder to acquire those users. So you've got to think about that. Okay. The take rate is another question. I always ask for marketplaces. So what % are they able to take? For marketplaces, the average I've seen is anywhere from 10 to 20%. Some people push that up to 20, 25. Some people go super cheap, 5, 7, 6%, somewhere in there. If you're above 20, it starts to feel like too much of a tax and it starts to feel unsustainable. You're going to get pushback. In Uber's case, I think they started somewhere sometimes north of that, started coming closer to 20 or less. If you're down to 5%, then you start being not that different than credit card companies and payment providers that charge 3% and they do nothing. They're not even a marketplace. So if you're like, hey, the value assigned to this great app or service I've built is close to these payment providers that do like nothing for you, they're straight up toll collectors, then, and we'll do questions at the end, then you've got to ask yourself, how much value do I really have in this business? And investors are going to see it as a yellow flag. So you should be able to get, rule of thumb I say is at least 10% and defend that. And if you're getting pushback for doing 10%, there might be a problem there. How fragmented is the supply side? That's another big question. So if you have very concentrated suppliers, if you say, in autonomous vehicles, this comes up. This is an enterprise software as well. If you're selling software and your customer base is going to be concentrated, that's not as interesting from a strategic point of view, right? I was looking at autonomous vehicle software companies, and their lists of customers were like 30, 40 potential customers. And then out of those, I said, but really, we only think 3 of these will win. We don't know who, is Google going to win, Waymo, or is Tesla going to win? I don't know for sure, but someone is going to be this full stack autonomous provider. So you're going to have like 2 or 3 customers that matter. Well, strategically, you're at a big disadvantage then, because they can turn the screws on you. On the other hand, if you're a marketplace with a big fragmented supply side, millions of homes, millions of drivers, then that's to your advantage because they're not concentrated to turn the screws on you. So anyway, summing this all up, and this kind of, some of this supplier power stuff comes from Porter's 5 Forces. Raise your hand if you guys have heard of Porter's 5 Forces. I'm curious. Wow, so very few people. I would say, look this up. I mean, that's the other kind of takeaway from here is look at my marketplace work, but I didn't invent the academic work on strategic advantage, right? There's entire business school classes and curriculum and consulting firms put out to this. BCG, my former employer, has written a lot about this. So there's this guy named Michael Porter, who's a business school professor. Read his stuff, Porter's 5 Forces. That's, he says, look at suppliers, threat of new entrants, buyer power, threat of substitution, and competitive rivalry. Other people have other frameworks that you can look up. There's a 5 C's framework. There's plenty of frameworks you can find. But even if you're, you don't need an MBA. I don't even know if I recommend it, even though I got one. I don't know if I'd recommend it for being a founder. Works for some, not for others. But this part, you do want to understand. You want to, you do want to look at the academic and, work on this, the history that's been written about this, because there's so much there. It's actually surprising me, like, a room of founders, there would be such a small number of people who know Porter's 5 Forces, but that's telling to you that there's not enough in the founder community. There's not enough education about this. And I think often you'll walk in an investor meeting, they've all studied this like for hundreds of hours and probably at least 10 years, many of them since they were children. Like they're, so they literally have been studying Porter's 5 Forces, strategic advantage, and marketplace business model. So when you walk in, there's this information kind of asymmetry, and they're asking you all these hard questions, assuming that you've been obsessing about your strategic advantage. And by the way, that you have a good way to like compare to another 100 companies that are in and outside of your industry. And obviously you don't. But by brushing up on this stuff and taking either for marketplaces or whatever you think yours is, going, looking at all these other areas and really going deep and becoming an expert, you can kind of level that playing field of that conversation, answer their questions intelligently, and I think understand a lot more about your own business.
We love and use HubSpot at launch. It is awesome for marketing and for your sales team. They swear by it. They love the CRM, which is fast, intuitive, and robust. We've been using it for years and we love it. And a few years ago, HubSpot launched HubSpot for Startups. This helps startups grow and scale better and more affordably. It includes a steep, and when I say steep, I mean the steepest of discounts on the HubSpot growth platform. Startups get up to 90% off startup education and programming, and they also get access to HubSpot integrations at a startup-friendly cost. Thousands of startups are already using HubSpot sales, marketing, and services software. And now they're also learning from mentors associated with HubSpot for Startups. So get that mentorship so you're not reinventing the wheel and you're learning. Here is your call to action. I want you to go to HubSpot.com/startup/twist. Okay, there's 2 slashes in there. HubSpot.com/startup/twist. If you use the twist link, you will be entered to win a free ticket to HubSpot's 24,000 person live event, Inbound. That live event is inbound. Get it? Inbound, as in inbound sales. And that's September 3rd through 6th, 2019 in Boston. Thanks again to our friends at HubSpot for supporting This Week in Startups.
So I hope that was helpful. I saw there were some questions. What was your name?
My name is Sydney Olenek. I'm the CEO and co-founder or founder of Duco.
Duco, what does Duco do?
We are...
Never miss an opportunity to pitch.
We're where enterprises find, hire, and manage very high-end consultants. So we're a market network.
Okay,
So
awesome.
we're a marketplace that sits on SaaS.
Marketplace
So my
on SaaS,
question
cool.
was actually around, you talked a lot about the rake for marketplaces.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could dig
Rake
in.
is another name for take rate. There's all the
rate.
lingo. Yeah.
If you could dive in a little bit more on, you mentioned 10 to 20%. How does that change with the how frequent it is and how big the sale price is? So, for example, if you have a marketplace and we have very high sale prices, and so it's something we analyze a lot. Like if you start if it's in the thousands, then it starts to feel like a very large number. And so I was wondering if you had any more insight on that.
Yeah, Airbnb, if you look, they've got their fee they charge the consumer, and then they've also got a small fee that's close to it's basically pass-through payment, 3% they charge to the host. If you look, they add up to a similar number and they don't reduce it. It's crazy. You could book a $10,000 Airbnb stay. They don't kind of reduce that. And I only, real estate agents, right? They've got their rake, right? Which is like 5 to 6%. And so it's a little lower, but they're charging that on multi-million-dollar houses. And so basically my point to you is you will always get pushback on your take rate. But one of the this is a big, Andreessen Horowitz thing. They always tell enterprise software companies that their pricing is too low. So I'm going to take that baton and say, marketplaces often undervalue their take rate, delay introducing the take rate, lowball the amount of the take rate. And the concern is pushback. Of course, everyone's always going to be upset with you.
Or circumvention is a
So we didn't talk about risk of disintermediation. That's part of all of this. If switching costs are high enough, if the value you're providing is high enough, and we could talk about one more element of that, but people shouldn't have the need to or have a good way to circumvent or disintermediate you. Keeping not being at the egregious 20% will help. But even if the transaction's large, if your way of not getting disintermediated is like dropping from 9% to 6%, I don't think it'll actually help. I think on the margin, those small moves in percentage actually won't make much difference. Because 6% or 9% of a big ticket, what's what big ticket item for you?
$10,000.
$10,000. 6% of $10,000 is still a lot of money, $6,000. And so someone will still try and disintermediate you to save that $6,000. Right. The bigger issue is like, how do you set yourself up? So for TaskRabbit, this was a big challenge, is because they had this repeat usage. You would find somebody once, but you had less of a reason to kind of stay on TaskRabbit after that. And there are things they probably did that they did too late that could have solved that. One, charge a much higher take rate up front, and then maybe make it lower after that. Have good SaaS where it's not worth it for the person to rip you out. So there are things you could do like that. Yeah.
And
so that could be an example.
Thumbtack does like a referral fee, a one-time referral fee now.
Oh, yeah, she's saying talk in the microphone more. You're saying Thumbtack.
Thumbtack, I know they went over to a referral fee. So you get a one-time referral fee, and then you can use them outside of the platform. So
use them outside the platform. So being realistic about how you might get disintermediated and constructing the right pricing model there might be the answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm John. I'm the founder of a managed marketplace called Kudos. We're a personal training marketplace. So my question is, how do investors evaluate marketplace network effects? Because I think I have a good one, but we're early days, right? And so I'm trying to think about, I know it's going to work. How do I show the investors that 3 years from now we're going to dominate the personal trainer market? Does that make sense?
By the way, if you get big enough, what you'll learn is your lawyers will tell you, it's funny, startups say they want to dominate.
Don't say that word.
Yeah. Then they'll tell you don't say dominate. And stay up here because I have a question for you. So part of the whole point of this checklist I did, and we did the very light version, but if you read the articles I published on it, that's the whole point is, luckily you're a marketplace, a lot of marketplaces here today, so that's great. The whole point is to go deep and really fine tune and analyze your network effects. Instead of saying our network effects are great and using kind of superlatives, the idea is to dissect your marketplace the way an academic would. I was heavily influenced by this. I was kind of predisposed to like marketplaces as an investor because in business school, there was another professor, I'm giving you guys all these homework assignments, but there's a guy, Tom Eisenman, who pioneered a lot of the study of network effects. So he's got a seminal HBS article. I linked to it called, I think it's like On Network Effects Businesses. And it's mostly about marketplaces. And he puts a lot of the academic framework to ask these kinds of questions and more than I have in my 15. So I would say the key thing is like dig in on that. So figure out, what kind of marketplace is it again? It's
personal training. So we
personal
do a subscription, and coaches are desperate for clients. So the client is the very sought after piece, and they're willing to do anything to serve them.
The client. Yeah. So for example, showing that when you add a client, remember that metric, kind of like the Uber thing, that you sprinkle the clients and then X number of trainers come on, like showing that in a graph, running experiments where you enter a new market, throw a bunch of clients in, and then you show that the supply magically comes by itself instead of you having to spend lots of money. That's interesting. Showing that you have a proprietary or effective method of getting those clients in the first place that are hard for others to do. Showing that switching costs, are not as high. Substitute products is one challenge you have in the personal fitness industry. There's a dizzying number of products that are not exact competitors to yours, but serve the same function.
Sure. You
can go 24-hour fitness as a competitor, right? Like, so showing how you kind of work around that. I would say just digging in. The more of this homework you do for the investor, the less thinking they've got to do, and you've developed it for yourself, and it just makes it that much easier to have a meaningful conversation and feel better about your conclusions. Hope that helps.
Yep. Thanks.
All right. Okay. Next up, who do we got?
Hey, it's Alex. I'm the co-founder of. Good. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Co-founder of Agent Risk. We do wealth management for high net worth individuals using machine learning and option strategies. My question is on marketplaces. It's more about companies like ours or other companies that have regulatory, maybe moats or deep R&D or deep science or deep tech. How much of this is a real mode? Let's say you're pharma or Theranos, but
Yeah.
but
We won't
pharma,
use Theranos as an
deep,
example.
deep tech R&D. I come back from like storage and network stuff, and spend 2 years building a thing that's 10x better. I just want to take on that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would say there were a bunch, and again, my chart didn't include everything, so I'm glad you asked about these. Obviously, technology, defensibility or strategic advantage is, the basis of a lot of this industry. People said, well, we simply have a better mousetrap, right? In semiconductors, that was, in theory, and I never even worked on investing in semiconductors, so I don't know what their decks used to say. The challenge with the technology advantage when it comes to software is most investors, and you yourself should, discount it. Because software is hard to patent, easily replicable. Patents, most investors outside of biotech don't even care about patents at all. In fact, I would say patents being referenced in PowerPoint presentations for investors in the Bay Area today are inversely correlated with success of like that pitch deck, right? So the more the person talks about patents, the more likely the investor, because of their pattern recognition, will be like, oh man, okay, this guy is relying on the patents. Okay, like I'm not even going to necessarily invest here. For biotech, that's very different. Biotech has a set up formula because they've got clinical trials and the patents really mean something, but and hardware sometimes could be different, but not so much in software on the patent side. You could still have a technology advantage without patents. You look at autonomous vehicles. We're invested in a LiDAR company, for example. Like LiDAR, somebody can make the case that they've got a real technology advantage, so that can come up. I think what investors now, software investors especially, are more interested in are data advantages, like Google. So this like a data moat. Hey, all the data that we aggregate. Carta, for example, eShares was their former name. I don't know how many people are here familiar with eShares, but I'm an investor through my former firm, Social Capital, where we had led a round there, and one of my partners had joined the board, and the more and more information they got on all these Silicon Valley financings, and they had all the startups in there and all the investors in there and all their rounds, that started to accumulate a data moat that other people didn't have. Regulatory is another one you brought up. I'd say regulatory, the problem, it's so fickle. Regulatory usually is on, in an investor memo, the way I'll structure it, I'll have my investment thesis and upside, and then I'll have risks and downside. And then for the risks, I'll have mitigants. What mitigates those risks? Regulatory is almost never in the upside section. If it is in there, it's in, I'm an investor in Skip Scooters, one of the scooter companies that has the San Francisco contract. If you rode a scooter here today, competing with Bird and Lime, like regulatory, while they're, I think, the best company in the field in regulatory is still in the risk version of their, assessment. And then it's just mitigated by the fact that, we think they do it better than everybody else. It is harder to put a moat around that, I would say. At least, you might know something I don't about your own company.
I was learning something a
Yeah.
little bit different, but we'll take it offline.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cynthia. I'm CEO and co-founder of Altcoin Fantasy.
What is it called?
Altcoin Fantasy.
Altcoin Fantasy.
Yes.
Okay. What is that?
So let your mind wander. No. So we are a crypto trading simulator app. And what we do is we teach people about crypto and crypto trading through simulation and gamification.
Cool.
And so my question is around the first mover advantage. So when you're in an area that is still very new, so like deep tech, space, crypto and blockchain,
Yeah.
how much
Frontier,
is...
sometimes we call it.
Okay, yeah. So how much is the first mover advantage actually a credible strategic advantage? And do you have to pair that with something else?
So I'd say one way to look at short answer is definitely try to pair it with something else. Investors usually discount when they're seeing first mover advantage, and you should too. Because for every first mover that you see as a successful in the Fortune 500 or whatever top public companies, there are one or more fast followers right behind them. Like Google famously is not a first mover. Facebook's not a first mover. Like we can go down the list. Amazon had some first mover advantage. They weren't the first e-commerce site, but they were the first to really go for that level of scale and go aggressively. So it's not the first mover. And Uber's kind of first mover. They kind of copied Lyft, but those are both in a way first movers. Google and Facebook show us you don't have to be, but you could be. And that's the problem. Since it is a mixed bag, I think it will help you. I think the way I've heard founders best describe their first mover advantage is not as a sustaining advantage, but instead as a lead time advantage. So yes, we don't permanently have an advantage, but you describe it as a head start. We have this 1 year or 2 year head start. I've even seen a slide where someone will map out, okay, if someone's going to try and copy and build our software, this is exactly like they'll have to hire this many engineers, even if like Google tries to do it, at a minimum, no matter how many resources and how big your team is, you're going to have a design cycle and this, and you get it down to where like, okay, we have an 18-month head start from anyone's doing this. And we're looking around, we're reading all the financings and the Dan Primack, term sheet. Like nobody else is at our heels. So it's at least 18 months. And we're going to use those 18 months to do this other thing, like get some lock-in, build our network effect, or lock up the suppliers, or do something else that is a more long-term advantage.
Okay, thank you. And I'm glad that you mentioned the question about Google. I'm sure you guys have heard of this. Investors will ask, well, what if Google or Facebook comes in? You're like,
there's still a minimum amount of time that, by the way, if that investor didn't study computer science, one of the first projects they have you do at most computer science classes is they have you like build something, a hash table and some other stuff. And then they have you do something with a partner, a lab partner. And it basically is designed, if the professor does it well, to show you that the project ends up taking longer when you do it with a partner than if you'd just done it yourself. So there's a lot of areas of software development that the larger the team gets, the worse development. There is actually like a sweet spot. And I've written about this a little bit too. I don't know. I didn't do a whole blog post, but I've done some tweets on this about never underestimate how, as a founder, the fact that you're naive and you have a fresh set of eyes on the market, how much of an advantage that is. Always discount an investor like me, let's say with podcasting and audio, an investor who has domain experience, operating or investing experience in your area, always discount their advice because they have their battle scars and they're just projecting on you. By definition, their business didn't work or it's different than yours. You're doing something different. And don't get caught up in this. Google could just copy you. But the more granular you could get on exactly how long it would take Google to build this thing, that's helpful.
Right. Okay. Thank
cool.
you.
Thank you. All right. Next up.
Hi, I'm Young from V, co-founder and CEO. We are Airbnb for local ad spaces.
Local ad spaces. What was the name of the company again?
V.
V-E. You got to spell it every time you say it.
V-E-H.
Yeah.
So until network effects kick in, do you see a typical number of matches, transactions that happen where, you see a sort of exponential growth kicking in with the network effects? And then second question was, as an investor who focuses on marketplaces, what is the sort of the revenue that you typically seek when you look at new companies?
Okay, so both great questions. On the first question, I would call that the tipping point, right? When do you hit the tipping point where you say we've unlocked liquidity in this market? Uber had a number. They knew that, hey, we need to get this many drivers on the ground, this many riders, and then it actually feels like it's working. Right? Wait times are under 10 minutes. They're in the single digits, right? This is going to be bespoke for every business. I can't give you like a magical number on supply and demand because, in some businesses like where they have fragmented supply, which is not great, but if they're fragmented supply, they might only need 2 or 3. Airbnb in La Jolla, when they were getting started, they probably only needed like 4 La Jolla homes. And all of a sudden it was kind of interesting to Airbnb in La Jolla. So it's not that there's some magic number. It's more figure out what your liquidity metric or your other network advantage or strategic, advantage metric is, and then see when that number pops and look for that little exponential growth. Unfortunately, it's custom work you're going to have to probably do for each type of business.
Yeah, understood.
Yeah. And then, so your next question, wait, remind me what was the next question?
What is the threshold of revenue
for raising a round? And obviously it's very seed, Series A, Series B. I'll do Series A because that's one of the easiest ones. The common thing you guys have all heard is $1 million of annualized revenue. But I will say, I just got off the phone with a company that's got like $100,000 of annualized revenue, and this is net revenue. And I'm very excited about maybe their Series A because they've got like over $10 million of gross GMV, and that GMV is growing really fast. Now the problem is that take rate is too low, right? So you've got to figure out. They haven't really turned it on yet. Is the real thing, and you'll see that sometimes. So while $1 million in annualized net revenue is usually what you hear, for SaaS, that's really easy. For marketplaces, you just multiply the take rate. It's really all over the map, and it's very growth rate dependent. A rough rule of thumb is it's very hard in the Bay Area for top tier VC firms for a company to raise Series A if they're not growing 3x. There's this concept of 3, 3, 2, 2 for SaaS companies, like tripling, doubling, and that's on a big enough base. So like hopefully the year that you're in like the $1 million revenue, you've got a plan to then triple to 3 million next year. The math just isn't going to pencil out if you're only doubling. Think about it. If you're at $1 million now and you're doubling, well then, 2 to the 5th power, right, is 32. Like it's going to take you 5 years just to get to like 32 million in revenue, and you're still not close to being a public company yet. So they want those early years to have a little bit more. And it's good if you can translate your monthly growth rate into annual growth, and that's a helpful thing to do. So I think like 15% is about 3x annual growth, and 10% is maybe closer to doubling, or maybe I have that backwards. I'll have to check the tables. Looking at your monthly growth. So when I see a company, even if they're under $1 million net revenue, if they're at like 400K, well, if they're doing like 30% monthly growth, which is way over, I know, and I can annualize that. And they're doing that consistently. I don't care how low the revenue is. But similarly, you could be at many millions in revenue growing at 5% a month. Is probably not a venture backable business. So those are, that's how you think. And also outside of revenue, holistically, the broad thing you're looking at is product market fit. And the way you demonstrate that is in one, if you're a geographic business that's in certain regions, just in one market, nailing that liquidity and that matching thing. You don't even need to do it in 2 markets. And that's a pitfall I see. If you want to do a bunch of markets because that helps, or you have global network effects, great. But if you're just a local network effect kind of business or regional business, just nail that one and show product market fit that one place. And you can worry about expanding to multiple in the Series B. Cool. Yeah, thank you. 2 more questions. Okay.
Hi, I'm Om.
How's it going?
I'm the founder of Squirrel. It's a wellness platform for today's workforce, specifically small businesses, startups, and the gig economy.
Cool.
And my question is about defensibility for B2B enterprise products.
Yeah.
So is the ability to deploy a solution and for an unaddressed market on its own a good moat? And if not, then what are some good examples you've seen? Okay,
so say the name of I was parsing the business does what? It's a...
So we personalized deploy and deploy a wellness program for workforces.
Okay, like literal physical, eating healthy, exercise,
emotional, physical, and financial.
Okay, got it. Yep. Okay, and then the question was.
The question is about defensibility.
Yeah.
And just is the ability to deploy a solution in an unaddressed market really quickly a good enough moat, or if not, then what?
Short answer is I would look for more. I would say time to deploy is obviously important, but unless nobody else can deploy as fast as you, like why can't another startup or a larger company come, realize that time to deploy is helping, and then just make their time to deploy fast? If there's something proprietary that you guys have that you think nobody else has, maybe, but I would look for something else. For example, there could be a network effect. The more people get on your platform, the more employees you hit a tipping point, they actually start to, share stuff or collaborate. Fitbit had that for a little while. They had these corporate sales that were going well. That didn't sustain, but that was something. But trying to find something else, I'd encourage.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Hello.
Hi, Christopher.
Yes. I'm Christopher. I'm the co-founder of Nui Foods, where we make cutting out sugar ridiculously easy.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So
I try to minimize sugar as well.
We made the first keto cookie, and so we were first movers, but we've seen people that are coming into the space. Yeah. So how would you build a moat around a food consumable?
Well, yeah, by definition, a food consumable is really hard to build a moat around. One of my partners, Rebecca Lynn, she came from Procter & Gamble, and she was talking about, hey, I had to brand and, take a commodity like toilet paper and like build a brand out of this. That's what the CPG companies do really well. It is hard, right? Because they don't have, so their moats tend to be other things. And going on this chart, they tend to have locked in distribution. So that's like kind of on the buyer side. They'll sometimes have more leverage and more power than their buyers do. That takes a lot of scale, and that's difficult to do. But if you can find a special distribution channel, that's one that the others box them out somehow. That could be something. Proprietary access to supply could be another kind of side of that as well. But and then branding is another one that the consumer guys do. So there's this water company now. I don't know if you've seen it, coming out of LA. Peter Pham's an investor. I think it's either called Liquid Death or something like that.
BLK?
Huh?
Or no.
No, it is Liquid Death. Huh?
Oh yeah.
Liquid Death. So there's a water called Liquid Death, and it's just like I think, and I barely know about it. See, I've never even seen it in the wild. I've only seen it on Twitter maybe, but I think it's kind of like heavy metal, headbanger, kind of, rocker, tough. I think they're going for masculine, probably like manly water. And the idea is, if you're at a bar and you're not drinking, maybe somebody has alcoholism, or they just don't want to drink every night, they're in a band or whatever it is, they don't need to go have this beer that's all that other manly advertised. They can have this manly Liquid Death water. It's so outlandish, it's so weird, it's so different, but it actually stands for something. It's a different brand. It's hard for someone else to be like, we're Liquid Death Part 2. People could try that, and they probably will. But at least, so branding is another way that even as a startup you could try to do.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, we're out of time.
Yeah, we are,
Thank you,
unfortunately.
everybody.